Now we got a Mac.
This is Phil's. So we've got our regular computer down there. We'll just switch these out for yours.
Oh, so I could have used my computer.
Switch out, so you'll know.
Do you want to?
Well, I would have, just because I would have made some tweaks in the PowerPoint in response to last night, but that's okay.
Okay.
Do you have a clicker, or should I provide
We
mine?
have a clicker.
Great,
yeah.
perfect.
Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Welcome back to our Science for Seminary series of lectures, Jesus Christ, the Gospel of Jesus Christ and Big History. And Dr. Lemna and I have just a short announcement to give you about the schedule, and that is the last part of the schedule, the panel discussion, which was scheduled for 1:15 to 2:15. That does not work with the available flights going out of Louisville today, and so we have moved that from being a public venue to being just a small venue with a few select students during lunchtime. So there will not be a public event after noon. We will wrap up today by around by noon. All right. There are going to be refreshments available in the lobby of Bede Hall here. In between the talks, and we'll try to have a 10-minute break in between and kind of get in and come to the next talk. If we need, we can extend that out to about 15 minutes, but please come back at the right time so that we can get on with our next speaker. There's going to be a lot of good content for you to mull on today. Now, it is a joy for me to introduce our next speaker to you, Dr. Philip Kurian. He gave a presentation at a Science for Seminaries event that Dr. Lemna and I attended last year online. And during the break after his talk, Keith and I met in the hallway and said, we have to get this guy at St. Meinrad, because his topic was not only perfectly in line with the project that we had, also we were impressed by his enthusiasm, his ability to explain very high-level concepts in a way that even we could understand, even I could understand. And we were also charmed by his great personality. So it was an easy decision to invite him here today, and we're so grateful that he was able to come. Philip Kurian is a theoretical physicist. He's a researching scientist and essayist. He serves as the founding director of the Quantum Biology Laboratory at Howard University. He is a visiting research professor at the University of Iowa. He began his career as a math teacher in North Philadelphia, and he is now the recipient of fellowships, grants, and awards from the U.S.-Italy Fulbright Commission, Argonne and Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facilities, Whole Genome Science Foundation, National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. His laboratory studies how quantum behaviors can explain biological phenomena, including neurodegeneration, cancer, and human consciousness. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Philip Kurian.
Well, good morning. Thank you so much, Father Thomas and Professor Lemna, for just giving me this opportunity. I'm really excited to be here at St. Meinrad in Indiana. It's really exciting for me because I got their invitation actually while I was in Switzerland, and I was actually just a few hours outside Zurich. So I ended up, after accepting the invitation, going to Eiselden. And so I don't know if any of you have been, but that's actually me in front of St. Meinrad's, the father home, right, or the mother home. And so I like the context for this because in that interaction of subjectives, my giving the talk to AAAS, and then even further, me finding that experience of getting an invitation literally at the time I was near where I could visit, it reminds me how subjectives do science, okay? So when we do science, we are starting from the self and then we are looking out at the world. So whereas science tends to focus and fixate on the external world and on experiments, what I'm going to do is to try and sketch for you a renewed vision for science. A sketch, I'm saying because, as I was telling Professor Lemna, it's hard to have these conversations with scientists. But in a space like this, where there are some scientists, there are, seminarians, there are theologians, there is a new opportunity to have an expanded dialogue. So, let's get started. So the first thing I'd like for you to do is to just consider a tree, okay? What do you observe when you interact, not with this tree, but with a tree in general? If you have no special equipment, you may resort to using some subset of the 5 senses to experience the tree, right? The roughness of its bark, the soughing of its leaves in the wind, the rich colors and bright interplay of light and life in its branches, the cool shade it offers, the fruit it bears, the hardness of the seeds within that fruit, the partial exposure of its roots. And maybe if you are curious, all this noticing and observing will lead you to question the limits of your senses to fully experience the tree. So then the scientific question arises. What tools could help us observe the roots or the branches, the leaves or the fruits, the seeds and their constituents in greater resolution? How can we see them better? Other questions may soon follow close behind. How do the leaves, roots, and other parts work together to form the fruit? How does a tree know when to produce fruit and when to shed leaves? Why are some trees different? Do trees communicate, and if so, how? Will our advanced tools help us to better discern its treeness? Okay. So this talk isn't about trees, but it is about the foundational question behind things. The foundational question is, what lies behind the appearances? So a similar question was asked by Owen Barfield. He was the, quote, the wisest and best of C.S. Lewis's unofficial teachers, as Lewis estimated. Barfield begins his book, Saving the Appearances, by considering a rainbow. Unlike the tree, the rainbow seems further from our direct apperception, in that it cannot be touched, smelled, tasted, or heard. The rainbow in particular is a physical phenomenon that is uniquely perceived only by observers who are outfitted with eyes that can see in the visible spectrum of light. So in other words, there's an interaction, there's a relation between the light from the rainbow scattered off these water droplets and the visible receptors in our eyes. If an observer were only to see, for example, in the ultraviolet spectrum, as some insects do, the rainbow, as it were, would not be drawable as here. So we can, of course, ask questions about the rainbow similar to those we asked about the tree. An additional nuance now arises. Does our lack of ability to touch, taste, smell, or hear the rainbow reduce its realness? What do we mean when we say that something is real? In the case of the rainbow, we can use physical principles to explain its emergence from light scattering and dispersion through these water droplets in the sky. The explanatory power of those physical principles has given us the capacity to predict, to mimic, and enhance natural phenomena even beyond our existing sensorium, what we were given naturally or God-given as human beings. So instead of touch or feeling, the more concrete senses, we substitute words like sensing or influencing to describe a physical link that mediates an observable effect. So feeling the rough bark of a tree, for example, it emerges from an effect caused by the repulsion of negative charges in our hands and in the bark of the tree. But we as humans experience the roughness. We don't experience the charge distributions, at least as far as I'm aware. So seeing a rainbow involves the transmission of dispersed light to our eyes. But the underlying laws, the mathematical equations that describe those two phenomena, the seeing the tree and seeing the rainbow, are really unified under the equations of electromagnetism in physics. You may know them as Maxwell's equations. We move from the more concrete to the more abstract, And where do these equations lie? As perception becomes less direct, we must rely on those mental maps, right? The tools of thought that are invisible, even though they may be correlated to certain physical observables. So, as a third example, now consider an electron. What is your mental map of the electron, right? So this is actually some complex molecule that's represented, as is customary with these balls and sticks. And these common representations ultimately are false, right? You may have seen from high school or, wherever your science education led you, an atom orbiting around the nucleus. And this is highly misleading at a quantum level because that kind of picture would be dramatically and catastrophically unstable. You'd have radiation, the charged particle would go into the nucleus, and all matter as we know it would cease to exist. But it's true. Quantum scientists now understand from many experiments repeated over decades that matter has both particulate and wave-like character. So contrary to this picture that matter is mostly empty space, it's actually mostly probability. It's a probability distribution. So empty space is not quite right. So our models are always not quite right, okay? The careful listener, though, will immediately raise a series of objections. Aren't trees that we can feel with our hands composed of atoms? And don't those tree atoms have electrons, which allow us to feel the trees? It's all true. But how can the stuff of solid reality, the trees, be made of invisible bits that are ephemeral waves? Is the stuff of matter really so capricious? If there is order and law to matter, as physicists insist and believe, then why are the governing principles behind the appearances so finicky, so subject to choice and context? These are good objections, but there are even other ones, perhaps more foundational to our purposes here today. If I imagine a tree or rainbow in my mind, what reality is associated with that form of apperception? If two of us agree we see a tree or rainbow and we experienced it together, does that make it more real? What about if we both imagine a tree or rainbow together? Is that less real? To what realm do we attribute this world of inner subjectives interacting? The individual consciousness or consciousnesses that does the observing, the choosing, and the questioning. So what I am alluding to is about more than scientific methods. It's about the nature of a whole system of co-observing subjectives, in other words, life, with different observational capacities, making different types of observations, hypotheses, theories, and paradigm shifts in communities to construct scientific models of physical reality, philosophical frameworks for perceived relationships, and value systems based on their collective representations. These collective representations are based on mutually agreed upon apperceptions. They exist in the realm of thought, and they obey laws dictating relationships between quantities that should, in some cases, correspond to physical observables. So let's talk a little bit about dualities. Much of your education, I'm sure, traffics in these dualities. That between subjective and objective, the natural and the physical and the spiritual, mind and matter, potentia and manifestation, right? So this one thing that I want to say that undergirds, lies behind, and exists in a separate plane is this issue of truth and falsity. Because I'm not saying here that subjective is true and objective is false, but what I am saying is that things that are subjective can lie on a continuum of truth and falsehood. Know thyself, right? There are truer things about yourself, and there are falser things about yourself. The same with objective measurements. If you have a systematic error in your measuring device, your measurements will be systematically all false, all wrong, right? So this kind of idea that the subjective is untrue and the objective is always true, that is false, okay? The same with the other dichotomies or dualities here. But there are even more dualities, right? There's the duality between the known and the unknown. There's a duality between the knowable and the unknowable. And these are distinct. Having something that is known is distinct from having something that is knowable. And having something that is unknowable is distinct from having something that is unknown. And then finally, we have reality and symbol. We have the thing itself, but then we have something that points to the thing, right? And the two we cannot confuse, right? And good philosophy is grounded in that distinction where we don't confuse the two. So now we're at a critical juncture in the talk where I have to make the distinction between cumulative knowledge and individual awareness. So words that have been used in the past to describe non-overlapping domains. Here you can see them as the natural world and the supernatural world, whether people call it non-overlapping magisteria or whatnot. I think there's a better dialogue when we put them into contact through a third realm, the supranatural world. So I'm using this term specifically to describe a knowable realm that lies beyond the present awareness of an individual subjective or a community of subjectives. So such a world, like the supernatural, is knowable, but vast tracts of the landscape are unknown. So the decreasing thickness of the lines there, the pointers, is not coincidental. So a conventional sense of the natural world is one that perceives a solid and stable reality, even though what lies beneath is constantly in flux and behaves, when unobserved, unlike anything remotely resembling solidity. So the thickness of the lines corresponds to the strength of a perception, the strength of our intuitive but illusory perception of difference. The scientific fixation on observational capacities in the natural world has led us inexorably to the bedrock conclusion that the physical world is no more solid than the unknown but knowable supranatural world. Even within the physical world, there are unknowable elements, which are quantified in their unknowability by the Heisenberg uncertainty relations. The supernatural world, which likely cannot be reduced to a mathematicized description akin to physical law, is posited here as a world of knowable order. Superseding the natural world, but where thought, emotion, will, passion, soul, and spirit are conceived and interrelate. A similar but distinct diagram could map the known, the unknown, and the unknown but unknowable, and the unknowable worlds, but such a map would not be overlapping in this way. On the contrary, the supernatural world need not be unknowable, but that is merely a central assumption of modern materialist philosophy, which insists that physical things are all that exist. Its corollary, positivism, then negates the existence of the subjective self accordingly. So confusion lies in misassociating ultimate reality, you know, when Neo sees behind the Matrix, right, in the Matrix movies, right? That's what lies behind the appearances. For what is simply conventional, known, and familiar, common sense reality, what is known is not more real than what is unknown, just as a country you have never visited is not more real after you travel there. It is just more known and familiar to you. Your inner subjective has discovered something new, but truly you have just merely rediscovered what other subjectives already knew. So this is an important point. This mystery of interlocuting, analogizing, and discovering for oneself the unknown is a process ultimately without method. It is a qualitative leap of faith, to use a kind of Kierkegaardian framework. There are guiding principles, and humility of one's own knowledge and awareness is an essential starting point. For indeed, a prerequisite to genuine discovery is a deep commitment to uncovering and recovering the insights of subjectives who have come before, or who co-discover with us. Such prior and cumulative knowledge is necessary but insufficient, for at some point the demands of life will test one's commitment to discovering truth. So this brings us to the rub. As Pilate asked the King of Kings, what is truth? It's important to distinguish here between capital T truth, as I'm using it here, and everyday truths of common existence. which upon deeper reflection are realized to contain elements of capital T truth, no matter where, when, and in what context we observe. This distinction reflects the same difference between ultimate reality and the common sense realities experienced on the ground in daily life. In fact, the challenge for scientists is to remain sensitive to this boundary with the collective unknown. And I did say I was going to give a sketch, so this is actually my sketch, right? And you can see it here with this curve that I call the supernatural, right? And so that boundary of the collective unknown, even as exists, even as various hypotheses, theories, and paradigm shifts occur in the world of the finite and the known. The crucial issue is another duality. A full description of the natural world would be infinitely complex. So we resort to quote-unquote explainable models which describe that complexity in simpler terms. But our knowledge of nature remains finite. There is and will remain an irremediable gap between what we know, our scientific models, of physical reality, our philosophical frameworks, our logics, our creations, and the truth. So the danger that some scientists have fallen into is equating their limited models with the truth, making them coextensive with the truth, flattening the infinite richness, complexity, beauty, and mystery that lies behind the appearances. So rather than seeing the limited models in all modesty as just personal contributions in stepping toward the truth, they have reified their models as all that can be. So you can hear resonances of this hubris in statements regarding the standard model, grand unified theories, or a theory of everything, which the late physicist Stephen Hawking recanted on his deathbed. These statements reflect an underlying worldview, one in which scientists have made their necessarily finite maps equivalent with the infinitely complex terrain itself. There's a one-paragraph short story by Jorge Luis Borges called Del Rigor en la Ciencia, which describes an empire where cartographers make a map so large, so detailed, and so exact that only the scale of the actual landscape will suffice in one-to-one correspondence, right? So this map is obviously completely useless and is discarded by generations afterwards, right? Is this where science is headed? So these statements reflect this worldview. I'm not denying that some scientific maps are more in correspondence with or have more efficacy in predicting observables in the physical universe than others. But I am cautioning against reading any scientific map as ever reaching a singular point of finality where any subjective observer is done with discovery. A map may be good enough for a given purpose, and that's why we use it. But the universe is always ready to teach us something new. So truth is difficult to approach. It's difficult to get behind the appearances. It's difficult to see behind the veil. Truth is more mysterious and capacious than what any one subjective can possibly observe, than what a whole community of subjectives, or even all humanity from all epochs of time can observe. Truth is infinite, infinitely rich and complex, capable of leading a subjective observer deeper and deeper into the very ground of reality itself. Existence, being. Our observations of the sun's behavior from Earth gradually led to a heliocentric model of the solar system. This model eventually gave way to a theory of gravity, in which the Earth and sun both orbit around the very center of the solar system, which is not actually inside the sun, but near it. A similar transition with missteps, false starts, incremental gains, and massive shifts occurred in the evolution from classical to quantum mechanics and from Newtonian physics to relativity. Such evolutions remind us that our prior maps are not wholly without value. Indeed, they are accurate within their domains of applicability. But they are also false in a strict sense that they cannot describe new observations that fall outside those domains. This is the human condition. We are limited by our mental maps of reality. If we constrain reality to our finite maps, we limit the possibilities for truth to be discovered, and we thus restrict human flourishing, becoming instead bound like the reductionist models we idolize. So I want everyone to consider the observational capacity of the self, but the measuring subjective. Kierkegaard was fond of saying the crowd is untruth and unfit to determine one's personalized relation to truth, right? Martin Buber, a 20th century philosopher, described very poignantly the difference between I-it and I-thou relations, right? So I-it and I-thou doesn't mean how I relate to objects and how I relate to people. With any person, place, thing, object, you can relate to that thing in a different level of intimacy. You can approach it with a true understanding of its context, and when you do so, you can relate to it as the thou. But if you treat something merely as an object, and human existence is always about going between the intimacy of I-thou and the practicality of I-it, there's a dynamism to go back and forth. But if you only think of things as I-it, we find ourselves in the state that we do, where everything is commodified. Everything is defined with a price tag, and that price tag limits the value that we can associate with it. So when you think about a subjective observer, we must think, okay, what are their capacities? What are their weaknesses? If a subjective is blind, the beginning part of my talk about a rainbow is completely moot, right? Is the observer dyslexic? Is the observer illiterate or innumerate? I'm not making a judgment about these weaknesses, but I am saying that it's important to recognize with whom we are engaging as a subjective. So how do our increased observational capacities in one arena, the augmentation of our sensory tools and devices, how does that debilitate our capacities in other areas? So modern science gives us new tools to probe the supranatural, but it can separate us from the wholeness of direct subjective experience. So for those who aren't scientists, I want to give kind of like my picture of how subjectives form their theories of the world. So there are, of course, many subjectives in this crowd in the world, but there are general observations that these communities make, and these are common to human experience with some subset of the five senses, and within prescribed bounds of what is normal, right? They're verifiable in mass by populations, but because these populations do not share common tools, they're prone to vast areas of disagreement. Now, a much smaller subset of human observation is called scientific. These require lots of time, resources, specialized knowledge, and the more uncommon the measurement, or the more uncommon the observations, the fewer subjectives can actually verify it because of resource constraints and other things. So in our augmentation of sensory tools and devices, we produce what Rob Iliffe has called the priests of nature. Well, he's referring to Isaac Newton in his 2017 book, but I'm using it a bit tongue-in-cheek here, because the question is, in what ways are scientists using their tools as a mechanism to distinguish themselves from the general population of observers? Which there are some cases in which there is a need for that, but then there are other cases where there is not. So it's also important to remember that these observations are not merely limited to human subjectives. If you've ever watched a squirrel attacking a bird feeder, for example, you can see the process of observation and hypothesis and even communication, right? So yeah, we'll return to this. So subjectives must agree on the terms of observation. Any two scientists that have to agree on an experiment and to confirm it, they must agree on protocols. What to measure, how to measure, when to measure, where to measure, right? And this is the process of science. And it takes lives and careers to develop that. So I'm compassionate to my fellow scientists who don't have time for philosophy, so to speak. But the result of that, and I'm describing it pictorially here as results or data, is a link between two subjectives or two teams of subjectives. And then when you produce densely connected networks of subjectives, you produce things like theories or facts. Remember that the original word for theory comes from the Greek theoria, right? Which was an Aristotelian psychology that described actually the movement of one's full conscious participation from knowledge to activated awareness. You know, I'm probably abusing it for the theologians, but that's my sense of it. So theory is a contemplation rather than something solid. Right? Now, you saw on the previous slide, there's general observations, and then there are scientific observations, but the line is sometimes blurred. So the boundary between who is included in a particular observing process depends on the value and the quality with which we ascribe to different data sets. So there's immediate questions. What is high quality? What is careful and rigorous when we describe data? Who defines what is valuable when there is disagreement? That's a major issue. What does it mean when we say objectivity? So specialized protocols are highly conditional, and they're limited in their domains of applicability. And only sometimes are scientists explicit about this. So a very strict reductionism produces, frankly, idiocy. It's knowing more and more about less and less so that we can never communicate about anything. So going back to dualities, no talk to a Catholic seminary would be complete without some Aristotle and Aquinas. So it's important to look at this distinction between the Greek and the Latin, right? So in the original Greek, psyche actually meant life or soul, right? But as we go to the translation in Aquinas from nous to intellectus, I think we lose something, at least in the modern definition of intellect, right? Which it's not the faculty of the human mind necessary for understanding what is true or real. This really goes back to our sense, our apperception of truth, which is distinct, I think, from the intellect, which is mere reason. But there's a perception here. There's this movement from increasing solidity to increasing abstractness. The movement from, let's say, that which is manifest to that which is in potentia. And I love this, that one commentator even goes back to the unspeakable divine name, the tetragrammaton, right? And says that one of the ways in which the tetragrammaton was manifested was in the individual subjective's personalized breath accessing the name. So the name was given in this mysterious way such that individual subjectives had to utter it. And by uttering it, the individual becomes engaged in the I-thou relation with God. So going back to quantum physics, the wave function is a calculational tool. It's dependent on the observer, but it quantifies the observer's history of interactions with a quantum object, and it allows for probabilistic prediction of measurement outcomes. Psi, the wave function, which it's no coincidence that there's psyche and psi becomes a collectively defined mathematical representation of that quantum object when two or more observers agree on the representation. It has no ontological reality in itself, certainly no more than any other mathematical description. Our equations don't have an ontological reality. They may exist in a realm, but that's a distinction we can discuss. So this is the only slide that has equations, so hopefully I won't put you to sleep. But on the right, we have the Schrödinger equation, and on the left, we have Newton's second law, okay? So what's interesting, and most people get this confused, is that both of these equations are deterministic. However, there's an aspect of quantum mechanics that is probabilistic, and that is the action of measurement. And so there's a reason why at the foundations of quantum theory, there's a grain, right, in the soul of quantum theory, and it is in the quantum measurement problem. So I want to comment a little bit that this equation on the right is linear. Okay, what do I mean by linear? I mean that if you apply this operator H, which describes kind of the interactions of a system with the environment, you can apply it on the sum of two wave functions so that you get the evolution of the sums. So you can just apply it directly on both. And this is what you may have heard as superposition, right? But in measurement, we have a nonlinear process. We do not have this equation here, the Schrödinger equation, okay? So you can envision nonlinearity as follows. If I have a subsystem psi that is here, I have to measure it by an observer or a device called phi, right? And it also has a wave function. And this function h is actually a function of the environment, which is a function of phi. Likewise, there is a reaction of psi on the observer or the observing device. So that loop, this kind of entangled system exerts interaction on the system, but then the system exerts an action back on the measurer. And so there is an entanglement between the two. So the other thing I want to point out is that as you go from classical mechanics on the left to quantum mechanics on the right, you actually lose information. What do I mean by that? Classical mechanics describes a smooth continuum of values for all observables. You can measure them with infinite precision. Quantum mechanics says, no, in fact, you got to take that away. You can only see it at distinct points where you measure it, and even then, you can't know them with infinite precision. So if you want to think the Newtonian view is like adagio, and the Schrodinger view, or the quantum view, is like staccato, right? So here are some views and interpretations of that. The standard one is the Copenhagen view, which describes this kind of calculational tool of measurement. It says, okay, just go ahead. It's what we teach graduate students because it's easy to explain, and we move them forward to calculate, right? But then there are also views that give ontological reality to the wave function, and there are issues with that. The many worlds is one of them, which says, in fact, when we measure, we don't actually see one or the other in superposition, but we actually branch the universe into two branches, one where one thing is observed and the other where another thing is observed. There's also hidden variable theories, and there's a whole class of those theories, which actually describe a set of variables that are deterministic, but that underlie the phenomenon of non-locality that we observe. Now, I highlight the last two, cubism and the relational view of quantum mechanics, because they take seriously the idea that there is a quantum point of view, in the sense that the subjective matters in the measurement. Now, I think sometimes they don't go far enough, because they don't want, as scientists, to think that our view of scientific reality is conditioned by a subjective, but I think this is a problem. But even cubism and relational views of quantum mechanics assert that distinct observers can give different accounts of the same sequence of events. So we have to relinquish a universal objectivity. So we inhabit a relational and participatory cosmos. This is why things like name and the intimacies that we have with pet names and the way we communicate are valuable, right? We have metaphor to describe and analogize between contexts. We are interactive. We are interconnected. We are not isolated from our environment. No man is an island. No woman is an island. So networks of subjectives produce knowledge, but how can they promote wisdom? So measurement, if I make a measurement on a system, that is a relation I make with the system. Someone else can make a measurement with another system, or even the same system, but in order for us to compare measurements, we have to relate. We have to communicate. And there is a universal speed limit set by relativity, the speed of light, which creates sort of a bubble of communication around more or less the whole Earth, right? In the sense that we perceive things as simultaneous even though they are not, right? So I add to the picture of general and scientific with the idea that not only do we have interrelations between subjectives, we have a relation with the self. So the subjective relation with itself is extremely contrary to the positivist view that says there is no self. But in fact, self-referential, introspective, and interoceptive measurements are kind of a cutting edge in certain communities in science. But they imply a conscious selector behind the experiment. So this is a term that I've created called pseudolatry. And what do I mean by that? Science is not the truth. They are not equivalent. Pseudolatry is the replacement of limited observational models or philosophies for the whole and limitless truth. So human logic systems can themselves be shown to be both undecidable, meaning I can't decide if it's true or false, and incomplete, meaning that any axiomatic system I create will be limited. David Hilbert, Bertrand Russell, Alfred North Whitehead were frustrated by the fact that they could not exercise this undecidability and limitation from their logical systems. And even Aristotle and Hilbert as well described how using what's called the excluded middle, the idea that if something isn't true, it must be false, and it can only be false. This is really a presumption of Aristotelian logic. And there are other philosophers from other contexts, like Nagarjuna, who describe non-binary logics. And this was picked up in the 20th century. Well, not by Paul, but in the Epimenides paradox, it was then picked up later in the 20th century in mathematical treatments by Gödel, Hofstadter, Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in 2020. So if you're not familiar, the Epimenides paradox is something of the variant, all Cretans are liars or all human beings are liars. And if you give that a moment of thought, you realize there's an undecidability about that. So big science, which I'm terming the inflation of big scientific claims about truth and reality, and big religion have both made the mistake of flattening the infinite distance we have from truth, such that the scientific models or philosophical frameworks about the truth are inflated as the truth. So the miracle is that truth can be perceived and apprehended even though partially and imperfectly. So this is what I started the talk with. What's the danger? What's the danger of doing what big science and big religion have done? Flattening the truth for ministers, theologians, and the spiritual produces pride. If we say our philosophical frameworks, our scientific models of physical reality, and our observations are all that is, then when you engage someone who is outside your system, you have an issue of humility there. The double danger of flattening truth and ignoring science, you might think as navel-gazing, right? You become self-absorbed and largely irrelevant to the outside culture, right? Now, I critique scientists even harder. The double danger of flattening truth for scientists is arrogance in its smallest form, and in its largest form, it's deeply oppressive systems. So, and even the greatest scientists are prone to this, right? So Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen in 1935 defined physical reality in the following way, and I caution you to read the paper if you can, because this is taken out of context, of course. So without in any way disturbing a system we can predict with certainty, with probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to this physical quantity. So it is a very precise mathematicized description that's describing commuting observables. But the problem with that is that if we can't predict with certainty, how do we give reality to those observations that we cannot predict with certainty, that we don't know how to predict? In the worst of cases, this can lead to completely restricting observations that lie outside our community. And scientists are as prone as any to say, oh, this is what the community says about something. So our models and worldviews are limited because we sometimes exclude legitimate observations, which then not inappropriately contracts our physical models and our scientific models. So I found this great word in John Koenig's book, The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, called oculism, which is the awareness of how fundamentally limited our senses are, which makes us wish we could experience the whole of reality instead of only ever catching a tiny glimpse, to just once step back from the keyhole and finally open the door. I wish we had a vision for science like this, and I hope we can be part of creating that, rather than this picture on the left. So is science the only way to perceive truth? I hope by now we can all say that the answer is no. Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling does a great job of describing why Abraham, the founder or the father of the monotheistic faith, was so great in becoming a sort of stranger to all his comrades, his family, his own son and wife. In doing so, he engages with the thou in such a way that the totality of truth becomes perceptible to him and him alone, which is a very scary place, right? And this is what we can say about subjective apperception of truth. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who I had the privilege of being in conversation with just a few weeks ago, describes the duality of language. And while spiritual types are often very comfortable with this, science proceeds by unambiguity of language and identification. But within that, there's always this sense of proverb, of riddle, of metaphor. So a proverb is a codification of wisdom, a spiritual, has the three parts of a cognitive process, a sensory experience, something that all of us have access to, or most of us, from which emerges a story that is subjective, that in turn becomes the basis of a universal, a generalization, but a pithy statement applicable in many situations. So I think we have to look to the humanists, the theologians, and the spiritual types to give us this language of riddle and metaphor and parable. So as I conclude, I want to talk about the cosmic Christ in big history, the Christological singularity. When we have this grand mystery of how truth can empty itself to enter a human form, right? We have this grand mystery of the faith, but we also have an opportunity to understand what it means to be in relation, right? The second person of the Trinity in every era, in every context, in every culture, in every country, in every community, has the opportunity to be engaged as truth, has the opportunity to then form new relations. And then it is imperative, it's not that truth sets you free. It's that the truth that you know, the truth that you are familiar with, is that which sets you free, right? So as these subjectives go through history, including ourselves, we are called to engage that second person, not only with each other, the I, thou, but the first person, the subjective, and the third person, the we, the it, they're mediated by the second person. So Descartes, you all know, I think, therefore I am, was actually preceded by something else. It's not that I think and then I exist. In fact, what precedes it is I doubt, therefore I think. So there is the existence of the subjective before you think. And I would even change it even more, because I think there's some problems with this Western worldview. I would say summus ergo refero. We are, therefore I relate. So we are, and then we must relate. Okay, so some people have some objections to the relational view, or to even this interpretation of quantum mechanics, in that if I have a subjective and a system that's being measured, which you've seen on the previous slides, and then I have what's called Wigner's friend in the physics literature, but basically an observer measuring the observer measuring the system. You then have an infinite regress of subjectives. And some people in the early days of quantum theory said, okay, well, we must posit a self-referential immediate access. We must posit something that can know immediately what the outcome of measurement is. And that's what we know as the self, right? The subjective. But another resolution of the paradox, and there are many, and we can talk about this, is that at the end of time, space-time as we know it, there exists an ultimate and final observer, the alpha and the omega, right? And in the end of time, when we find this ultimate and final observer, this ultimate and final observer will both stand outside of time, but then will also undergird all observations of all subjectives throughout all human history. And that undergirding of all of subjective reality and all of objective reality will be unified in this ultimate and final conclusion. So I mentioned Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and I think it's after the talk last night by Peter Casarella, it's a great context to jump off, because I think in other cultures and other languages, we have words to describe the phenomena that we're interested in. Dualities in our thought are reproduced in the dualities of our language. So Ngugi, who was actually imprisoned by the neo-imperial or neo-colonial Kenyan government in the 1970s, describes that the du in Bantu languages stands for that which connects material and abstract being, the being of phenomenal nature, nurture, thought, and spirit. It's the primary substance. In Hebrew, you might connect it to tohu abohu or something like that. It expresses the interdependence of all